Hello students, today we are going to try and understand the concept of state, the various form that the state takes and the phenomena of nation and nationalism. And we are going to conclude with an understanding of what globalization does to the phenomena of state in modern societies. In political sociology, power is not merely the preserve of governments. In fact, power is a component of all social relationships to the extent that relationships involve regulation, influence, coercion, control. However, modern societies are subject to a new form of authority, that is the nation state. The nation state took a variety of forms but ultimately claimed control over a bounded territory. States establish power and influence over its populations. By the 20th century, the entire world was divided into nation states, which played an important role in the regulation and control of people's everyday life. This relationship between the state and society is what has been the central focus of political sociologists. Now, what is the state? The state is a political institution which, according to Weber, claims a monopoly over the legitimate use of physical force over a population in a given territory. Now, how does it do so? It formulates codified laws, criminal and civil laws, and has the right to judge and punish. It also then is able to regulate the public conduct and private behavior of individuals. States play a very important role in regulating the economic activity of society. They do this by wresting power from the capitalist class, or they may cooperate with them, serving their interest, or maybe a bit of both. The modern state is a very important employer of people. States also maintain military power to defend themselves against external aggression. States govern through the use of bureaucratic means. States also garner their social legitimacy by securing loyalty to the national community and thus providing an important source of identity to modern individual subjects, because they become fundamentally citizens vis-a-vis the nation state. Now we are going to try and look at two of the fundamental forms that states have taken in modern society, that is the authoritarian form or the democratic form. Authoritarianism. Now, in authoritarian regimes, unlike democracies, popular participation is either denied or severely restricted. Those who are in power are not accountable to the people, and their policy decisions do not require any form of social consent from the people. The state is not really invested in meeting the needs or interests of the people, and there may be an absence of legal mechanism to remove those who are in power or to even criticize the government. According to Robert Dahl, authoritarian regimes lack public contestation and inclusiveness. Now, there are various kinds of restrictions that are associated with authoritarian regimes, such as people in such regimes are not allowed the freedom to form and join organizations. There is a curtailment on the freedom of speech, on the right to vote, on the freedom to contest free and fair elections. Authoritarian states do not permit the organization of opposition parties and public participation through universal suffrage. Now, even if there exists some form of election or some form of political participation, it is always limited so that there is no threat to the already established power in an authoritarian regime. According to Joan Linz, he characterizes authoritarian states as stable political arrangements, which have ways of obtaining legitimacy, obedience, and recruitment of political elites. Now, they generally do not have a elaborate political ideology, and they don't involve a lot of mobilization. Whatever limited mobilization they may have is in its state of inception, when the authoritarian regime is about to be formed. Now, Linz argues that there is a very clear-cut distinction between authoritarianism and democracies, and a transition from authoritarianism to democracy actually can be made possible only through a violent revolution. He also tries to distinguish authoritarian regimes from totalitarian regimes, which he argues have a very definite political ideology, and they are upheld by a single mass party which concentrates power in an individual and their collaborators. Now, some important examples of authoritarian regimes in present times is North Korea and the absolute monarchy of Saudi Arabia. Of course, there are some historical examples such as Nazi Germany. Italy under Benito Mussolini and Iraq under Saddam Hussein are examples of authoritarian regimes. Again, there is a very interesting example here of Singapore. Now, Singapore is often considered to be a soft authoritarian regime. Now, what does that mean? Since its independence in 1965, it has had one single party which has always been in power, which is the People's Action Party. And there exists a very stringent regulation of the activities of the population. There is curtailment on the freedom of expression, internet curtailment exists, but interestingly, Singapore also has a very high level of economic development. The population has a higher standard of living. There is high employment rates and general civic order. The government, however, has strict laws and punishment even for minor offences like smoking or public littering. The police also have extraordinary power to detain citizens of suspected crimes, and corporeal and capital punishment are not uncommon, and hence sort of Singapore is seen as an example of a soft authoritarian regime. We are now going to try and discuss the more important and the dominant mode of state that we see in modern society, which is the democracy. Now, the word democracy means rule of people. It is a political system which comprises of government bodies which are generally elected by the people, right? These democracies generally embrace universal suffrage, which is people, irrespective of their gender, caste, race, have voting rights to elect the government. Free and fair elections are held at regular intervals, and these forms of state actually guarantee political equality. They safeguard various kinds of liberties and freedoms of individuals, right? Such a system is geared towards the needs and interests of people and their demands of self-moral development and actualization. Now, democracies, of course, differ from each other, sometimes in terms of their function and the extent to which they follow the various democratic ideals that are there. Now, there are two ways in which we can divide democracies, namely participatory democracy and representative democracy. Now, participatory democracy is a situation where all adult members of the population can actively and directly participate in the various decisions that are taken by the state. Now, this was something that was practiced in Greek societies in the polis of Athens, but interestingly, participatory democracies are difficult to establish in modern societies because they have enormous amount of population. But even though you do not have participatory democracies at the macro level, there are still some examples of participatory democracy. So say, for instance, in small towns in Northern England and US, what you see are the prevalence of town meetings which are held at regular intervals where people come together to make local decisions. Likewise, you have the concept of referendum. Now, referendums are basically a situation where the state asks its population to vote on a particular issue or to answer a set of questions which may then affect the policy decision or the enactment of laws of the democratic state. So, these are two examples of the continuation of participatory democracy in some forms. The dominant mode of democracy in modern society is, of course, the representative form of democracy. Now, in this, citizens do not directly take political decisions. Rather, they vote in elections and select representatives to political bodies. Representative may operate at national, local, and regional levels. In liberal democracies, generally citizens choose between two or more political parties. Say, for instance, in case of US elections, as you know, you have the two dominant parties, that is the Democrat and the Republicans. Now, liberal democracies are characterized by political and civil liberties, adherence to the rule of law, and the separation of powers between the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. Most developed countries of the world, including USA and UK, are liberal democracies. Developing countries also have adopted the democratic model, India being one of the largest democracies in the world. Argentina and Brazil are also important examples. Now, there are other ways in which democracies are also distinguished. One is to distinguish it in terms of formal democracy and substantive democracy. Formal democracies are those which follow the democratic procedures, but their commitment to democratic values may be a bit suspect. Now, in case of substantive democracies, not only do they follow democratic procedures, but they also show a great level of commitment to democratic values. Another way in which democracies are distinguished is in terms of restrictive democracies, where the adult population that votes may not be all. So say historically it has been seen that only white men or adult men or men who had property actually had the right to vote, and not everyone. But an unrestricted form of democracy is when the suffrage or voting rights are universal, which means all members have the right to vote as long as they meet a certain age criteria, which is generally 18 years and above. This distinction highlights the fact that democratic process is not uniform but actually a matter of degrees. Now, the democracies in North America and Western Europe have actually evolved from sort of formal to substantive and restricted to unrestricted democracy. So there is always an evolution of democracy, of becoming more and more representative of its people. Now, it has been seen that from the 1980s onwards, there has been a turn globally towards democracy, right? So say nations and states in Africa, America, Latin America, they have all begun to democratize from the 1980s onwards. Now, what are the reasons for this? Now, there are four important reasons for this. They are the fall of communism, the spread of globalization, the existence of international governmental organizations, and economic development. Now, the fall of communism. From the 1980s, you see that many communist regimes began to lose power. Some of them include Hungary, Poland, East Germany, and of course the most important one being Soviet Union, where all of its 15 constituent states eventually sort of declared independence in 1991. What this effectively did was it marked an end to the Cold War between liberal democracies and communist states. Even in China, there were prominent student protests that occurred in 1989, although they were brutally suppressed. Now, communist states are socialist in nature, and they tend to imagine themselves as democracies, but they do not provide as much freedom, because there are restrictions of freedom of speech, restrictions of media that characterizes communist states. But the fall of these communist states meant that you did not have any other option, that the future was actually liberal democracy, right? And this is an important factor in the democratization process in the world. Another important factor is, of course, globalization, and especially cultural globalization, because what the media has done is that it has spread democratic ideals, valuing equality, valuing freedom across the globe through the various media, and it has created an aspiration for change, which puts pressure on the political elites and authoritarian states to actually democratize and hold elections. Right? Scholars have also linked the desire for democracy with the spread of secular education and improvement in literacy rates. Also, the internet has proven to be a very important vehicle for the dissemination of ideas across borders and culture. Internet has played an important role in enabling mobilization of people against authoritarian regimes. So say, for instance, the recent Arab Spring revolution in sort of the Middle Eastern countries is a very important example where the internet was used as a way to, bring together protesters so that they could actually openly challenge the authoritarian regime in these regions. Another important reason for the global spread of democracy is international governmental organizations such as the United Nations and the European Union. Now, what these organizations do is, firstly, they are committed to obviously democratic values, but they also try to put pressure on authoritarian states along with other developed liberal democracies in particular ways. So what they do is they put forward strategies like trade embargoes, conditional provision of loans and aids, and other forms of political diplomacy to encourage democratization globally. Now, and finally, and very importantly, the reason why democracies are spreading is there seems to be a link between democracy and economic development, particularly capitalist development. What happens is that with economic development, you have the creation of a sizable middle class population. And this middle class population is invested in democratic ideals. They want certain kind of freedom, they want the right to choose, right? And global capitalism has played an important role in the expansion of democracies. You have transnational and multinational corporations for whom business requires to be conducted in stable environments, and democracies tend to be more stable than authoritarian regimes. Now, democratic regimes also tend to be less volatile for markets and investments. So, sometimes you will notice that states begin to actively promote the democratic agenda, to actually bring in foreign investment and to have transnational and multinational corporations carry out their operations within the state. So the economic aspect of society is a very important reason why there is a democratization of society. We'll now try and look at nation and nationalism. Now, while state are entities, as we've discussed, which have a fixed territory, they have a population, government and sovereignty, the nation is a shared cultural identity, which forms the basis of state formation in many states. Now, we're going to look at a very important theorization on the nation, which is provided by Benedict Anderson, who argues that nation is a very new phenomenon, actually occurred in the late 18th century, and it created a kind of modular form which could then be transported from Western Europe to other parts of the world. And it has the tendency to link itself with different kinds of political formations, be they authoritarian regimes or democratic regimes. Now, generally, he was critical of previous theories of nationalism, which saw nationalism as a kind of pathology of modernity, a kind of neurosis in modernity. And he said that we should think of nationalism not as a political ideology, not like fascism or liberalism. Rather, we should compare nationalism to phenomena like kinship and religion. Now, there is a particular way in which Benedict Anderson tries to define the nation. He says that a nation is an imagined political community, imagined as inherently limited and sovereign. Now, what does this mean? So, limited because no nation is coterminous with the world. Right? All nations have borders beyond which there are other nations, right? Why is it imagined as sovereign? Because nations imagine themselves as free, right? Nations are also imagined as a community of a deep horizontal comradeship. So even if there are inequalities within a nation, the general idea is that the relationship between members of a nation is always fraternal. Now, Anderson likens nation to religious imagining. Why? Because both were a means to transform human fatality to continuity. Now, what does this mean? Now, just like religion is an institution which tries to provide an answer to human mortality, to death, to loss, to grieving, right? Similarly, nation is an entity which tries to provide such answers, which is why it is able to have such an important emotional legitimacy. And very interestingly, Benderson also points out that in modern societies, you see there is a decline of religion, right? And also there is a decline of absolute monarchy, and modern society works with a new conception of time. And all these together help in the formation of a nation. But for him, the most important criteria why nations came into being or the national consciousness developed was the emergence of print capitalism. Now, print capitalism, in its endeavor to make profits, not only dethroned the hegemony of Latin, but it created these, sort of proto-national languages like English, German, French, right? Because you had actually a multiplicity of vernaculars. So when you had these written languages, it created a kind of readership. And these readers became eventually, they were the ones who could imagine a sense of a community, right? Which would become the nation. Now, not all scholars believe that nation is an entirely modern phenomena, even if it clearly has modern manifestations. The sentiments and symbolism that nation draw generally go back to a past in pre-modern times. So say, for instance, for Anthony Smith, nations often have direct lines of continuity with ethnic communities of the past. Now, Smith calls these communities ethnies. They tend to share a common ancestry, a common cultural identity, and links to a homeland. Now, many nations emerge out of ethnies, and ethnic communities of the past may resemble a nation. One important example is, of course, the Jewish people, who have had a sense of a community since over 2,000 years, even though the creation of Israel, which is seen as a Jewish homeland, only happened after the Second World War, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, which led to a mass extermination of Jews, as you may well know. Now, an important thing to understand when we are trying to understand nations is that while most nations have states, there are some nations which are, there's a persistence of ethne within well-established nations. which leads to a phenomena of nation without states, which means there is a sense of a nation and imagination of a nation, but it does not have the political organization of the state. Now, there are various ways in which we can characterize these nation without states, and I'm going to discuss three fundamental kinds with you. So, the first kind is a situation where the nation actually acknowledges the presence of ethnies within it. So, there may be cultural sort of differences of minorities or a minority within its boundaries, and in this case the state may permit some amount of autonomy to this community, even though national governments will continue to have the major power, but some amount of cultural difference and autonomy is acknowledged. The Basque country within Spain is one example, and a very important example of course is Scotland and Wales in the United Kingdom, right, where UK has granted certain kinds of autonomy to these regions, Scotland and Wales, to sort of have their own distinct cultural identity in some sense. Now, there are two examples where a very high degree of autonomy has been granted by the state to certain kinds of sense of a nation. So, these are the two prominent examples being the French-speaking region of Quebec in Canada, and the other is of course Flanders, which is a Dutch-speaking area in Netherlands. So here what you have is that these regions have the power to make major decisions, even though they are still not fully independent. Now, however, there are many ethnies or nations which completely lack recognition by the state, and in this case the larger nation state may actually use violent means to suppress any sort of claim to autonomy that these groups make. Now, nationalist movements by these groups are generally regarded then as anti-national, criminal or terrorist activities, because the state sees it as a threat to its own security, right? So, it tries to suppress these kinds of movements. The Tibetans in China and the Kurds in sort of Western Asia are important examples of communities demanding a separate state and being denied the same. To conclude, what I want to basically say is that the state is continuously being altered in terms of the process of globalization. So, as I've already discussed, there is the process of democratization and the spread of democracy everywhere. But also it's important to understand that the global world creates its own kinds of risks and challenges, and individual governments do not have the capacity to tackle issues that concern the world, such as the spread of diseases like AIDS previously, and now of course, say for instance the COVID-19 pandemic that we are all witnessing, global warming or the regulation of financial markets. Now, all these require all these global risks and challenges require some form of global governance and close cooperation among individual nation states. And of course, international governmental organizations like I've discussed with you, like the European Union and United Nations, as well as international non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International, can play a very important role in producing spaces for cooperation between various nation states to actually tackle all these global issues. Now, of course, this does not mean that the sovereignty or the freedom of the state or its jurisdiction or its powers are generally reducing. Now, there was this understanding that globalization takes away power from the states, and particularly because even multinational and transnational corporations seems to be posing a very important challenge to the states, where they do not have the power to regulate these transnational corporations, etc. But I think scholars are agreeing on the fact that it's not that the state is losing its power, but the state has to redefine itself, and it has to redefine its relationship with other nation states in order to tackle these global problems. So, this doesn't mean that the sovereignty of individual states will necessarily be compromised. Rather, it can usher a new era, an era where we are able to create a global peaceful order, where the rights of humans and non-humans are respected, and most importantly, we are able to save the environment, and global warming and climate change can be prevented, so that we have peaceful coexistence and the survival of the human species. Thank you.